Okay, I think we're ready to start. Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar on Straight from the Horse's Mouth. These are insights from business sellers. So this webinar is a little different from our typical webinars that are part of the Sunbelt Exit Strategy series, which are offered to our clients, probably every 6 or 8 weeks. Most of these webcast presentations are here to educate buyer business owners so that, when the time is right for them to move on to their next ventures, that they're well positioned to minimize taxes and maximize what they walk away with. For this webinar, I was very excited about inviting 3 past sellers so that you that haven't sold your business yet could learn from them. And I'd like to introduce the panel first. We have, let me change the, that's me. And here are our 3 panelists today. We have Gary Root with his wife. I think they were, where, Gary?
Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico a few years ago. I helped Gary sell his business back in 2005. And we were able to get Gary on with us today because 2 of the other past sellers had to change their plans at the last minute. Gary owned a sign business, and we sold that business in 3 months, which was way before the recession, obviously. And Gary, I recruited Gary over a year ago to be one of our senior brokers at Sunbelt. So thank you, Gary, for filling in today.
You bet. Glad to be here.
Our second panelist is Robert Dede, and Robert, one of my favorite sellers that I've worked with. He was probably one of the easiest people to deal with, which is nice. And Robert owned Maid Brigade, and we sold Robert's business for him just 3 weeks ago. And this is your first week out of training. Is that right, Robert?
That's right.
Good. Well, thank you for being on the panel. And our third presenter is Robin Stockwell, who I also love working with, and he was the owner of Succulent Gardens. And we closed Robin's business the end of August. And you're still in training your new people, aren't you, Robin?
I am.
And how long will that go on?
A year.
Yeah, so he was so valuable that they needed him to stay on a year for the transition. You'd had the business, was it 9 years, Robin?
Well, it depends on how you count. The nursery location is 9 years.
9 years, okay.
The business is actually since 1980.
Yeah, so you can see why they needed him around for his expertise. Just a little housekeeping I wanted to let everybody know about. We'll end the questions of the sellers at 3:30, and then we'll have about 10 minutes of Q&A, and I will unmute everybody so that you can ask questions. You can also put your question in the chat box on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, and we will see that and then answer those as they came in. So if you don't get your question answered today, I will definitely get back to you and make sure I can help you with that. So if everybody would put their phone on mute, we won't be interrupted by ringing phones, etc., just in case. I think I have everybody on mute. But well, let's get started. Thanks again, guys. The first question I'd like to address today is, how did you know it was the right time to sell? Gary, do you want to go first on that?
Sure. I essentially had planned on selling my business, and probably 2 years before I was going to sell, I just kind of put myself in a position to maximize my income. I had tried to sell the business 10 years before, and it didn't sell, and I got kind of re-excited about the business, and fast forward 10 more years, I was then again ready to sell, and so I kind of knew a lot about that and prepared myself for maximizing my profits and so forth. But
how many years had you had the business?
Well, I owned it for about 13 years, but it's a family business that I took over from when I was a child, so I've been there for over 30 years.
Gee, okay.
Which is a really good reason for selling. For 30 years doing anything, it's time for a change, unless it's marriage. That should last forever.
Okay, thank you, Gary. How about you, Robert? What was your motivation for selling?
Yeah, for me, it really just came down to time and distance. The office that I owned was in Redwood City, and I actually live in South San Jose, so it was roughly an hour and a half commute one way.
Wow.
And it just, over time, it just got to be too much, and that's what sort of motivated me to consider looking for something a little closer to home.
Okay, so you think you're going to try to find another business to get into? You sound too young. Well, I know you, but you're too young to retire, right?
Oh, much too young.
Okay. Robin, how about you? How did you know it was just the right time?
It was planned for a couple of years that I was going to retire by the time I reached the age of 70, and I announced to the world that I wanted to find someone to take over the business in a time that I could still spend time training whoever took it over, and
Right.
so this was the time.
Okay. And I will mention
I am old enough to retire.
To retire. You deserve it. Yeah. Robin is known by everybody in the industry and many people beyond that. He's just the expert in succulents and is an amazing speaker. By the way, for the audience, Robin received 4 offers from his business and got almost just very close to his asking price and sold the business in 7 months from start to finish. So it was a joy working with him. Okay, let's go to our second question. Is there anything you wish you'd done in preparation several months before starting the process? Gary, was there anything you were contemplating?
In my case, I would say that there wasn't, because I planned it 2 years ahead of time. But if I was doing it without that forethought, I think the most important thing is to, it's kind of like when you sell a house, you wanted to show it in its best light. It's really good to clean up the company and make it look nice, just aesthetically. And have clean books is probably
Good
key.
advice.
Yeah.
Good advice. How about you, Robert? You hadn't had it very long.
I didn't have the business very long, but sort of continuing with what Gary said, we kept pretty clean books also, and I think if we weren't so diligent, that would have been an area that we may have wished to do a little better on. But as it turned out, our books were pretty clean, and so there's really it was all a pretty smooth process for us. And so there's probably wouldn't be anything I would wish I would have done differently in preparation.
Good to hear it. How about you, Robin? Anything
I
you
felt
would have
pretty
done different?
prepared. I think my books were pretty good. I've always maintained a pretty good separation between the accounting, so that all the bookkeeping is historically been pretty good. I think my records could have been electronic, and they weren't.
That's
so
good.
Having lots of handwritten invoices made for some complexity. But other than that, I don't really think I would have known where to start to prepare. It was better just having a list of things to do as we move through the process.
Yeah, and I would say, Robin, of everybody I've worked with, you probably were the best communicator of anybody. We had at least 2 or 3 conversations or emails a day, because he had a very detailed buyer that was requesting a lot of information and permitting issues, and yours was much more complicated than the other 2 in this instance. Is there anything in hindsight, Robin, that would have made it easier regarding inventory? Because that was one of the biggest challenges to the buyer, was the inventory.
Well, I think if the inventory had been accurately depicted in an electronic version online, I grow plants. I have thousands of plants, and I haven't done an inventory ever. So the actual statement of inventory on the financial statement is way out of line with what actually is in the nursery. And that was a confusing point, but it was also, I think, handled in a way that everybody could understand why. It's a perishable crop.
Do you
So
think
I don't.
I was just going to ask,
Go ahead.
do you think the buyers will change that? Are they going to put SKU numbers and be able to make inventory easier to count?
We actually completed a full inventory on October 30th, and they were preparing to get crop insurance and had to have a complete inventory for that. And now the inventory, along with photos of all the different plants, is being entered into the system.
Okay, good. Let's go to question number 3. Did you get what you wanted from your sale? And I don't think that necessarily should be necessarily the price, but terms and other things from the sale. Gary?
Yeah. So as far as the price goes, in recollection, I guess I from research that Joan did here, I sold for 87% of my asking price, and knowing how I do things, I'm sure I had my asking price padded a little bit. Did that include the earnout?
Yeah, so why don't you talk about the earnout?
Yeah, so the way that we, a seller and a buyer are typically going to have a little gap or divide at some point, even if you're buying a house or whatever. We closed the gap with an earnout that was based on the annual sales for the first 2 years of the buyer's possession. So they had a number X to hit for gross sales. It was not complicated. The books are really easy to just add up what you sold. He hit his number. I got my additional payment. And then a year later, fast forward, I get another check in the mail. I mean, we didn't even have to go in through an audit process, because it was real clear that he hit the numbers that we had generated when we made the sale.
And you had a note?
I had a note for, I think it was about 12 or 15%, and that was kind of nice to get payments for 5 years after the sale. So I didn't mind having the note. The other thing was, finding the right buyer was important to me, and to this day, 9 years later, the gentleman who bought the company is continued with the business, and the BLR is a family, it's my grandmother's initials, so it was a family business, and it was kind of important for me to see that business flourish, and it has. So I'd say I got everything I was looking for.
Good. Thank you. Robert, how about you?
Yeah. So I was actually pretty pleasantly surprised when we went through the valuation process that we were able to post it for a little higher than what I purchased it for, and only having the business for a year, it was nice. It was nice to see that it actually gained in value. So, with regard to the actual selling price of the business, and we are carrying a slight note for the new buyer, but overall, very pleased with the overall sale and the overall price of the business.
Good. I just want to let the audience know that in many cases, sellers will be carrying a note. If the buyer is using the SBA, Small Business Administration, to help fund the business, they often will require that 5 or 10% is carried back by the seller at the, typically you ask for about the same rate that the SBA is charging, and that is done typically over 3 to 5 years. It's a small amount, but the buyers like it because they know you're not going to just go off into the sunset and never answer their phone calls. So notes are, I'd say, 90% of the time, sellers will need to carry a note, and Gary did, and Robert did. Robin at Succulent Gardens did not have to, which was nice. So how about you, Robin? Did you get what you wanted from the sale overall?
Yes, definitely. For me, one, I had several choices of the buyer. I got to choose, and I think that I was able to select someone that I felt would carry on the business that I had started, and that was very important to me. I get to continue being active in the industry, albeit in a much more limited fashion. And then I got the asking price was pretty much met, and I cashed out. I didn't have to carry a note. So I would say, all in all, I'm very pleased with the way everything went through.
Good. We were too. And if they have a very bright, savvy buyer that was a little went a little differently than typical, where Robin, his buyer was an attorney and his wife was an attorney, and so they did not use the typical California Association of Business Broker offer, asset purchase agreement, and so they presented a pretty lengthy agreement. So Robin, of course, hired an attorney to help him with that and to negotiate with the other attorneys. That might have been a surprise. I think we're going to get to that, but the cost of what it can cost for more complicated businesses, but we'll get to that too, Robin, because I want you to be able to share that. Number 4, when did you notify your key employees? Because I know this is something that all sellers want to know. And so, Gary, do you remember how you did it?
Yeah, so mine was 9 years ago, so this is based on recollection, but I believe I had 4 or 5 employees when I sold the company. One employee in particular was my right hand. I used to say everybody should have an Omar. But so Omar actually discussed whether or not he could buy the business with him, and he simply didn't have the financial resources to be able to do it. So he was aware it was going to sell. But other than him, everybody else, we waited until after, the due diligence, and it was time to basically introduce the buyer, reassure them that they still had jobs, and so we essentially waited till the end.
Okay, thank you. How about you, Robert?
Yeah, it's very similar to Gary there. We went through the due diligence process, and it was probably a day or two before we actually closed on the business where we notified the employees. We had about 23 employees, 3 of which were office staff, and I notified them in advance. And just because it was such a quick turn, I had the business for a year, so they had just recently gone through it, so we were a little concerned how they would react to the news. But overall, it went well. And then we brought in the new owner shortly thereafter, and he just sort of echoed, the same sorts of things that I covered with them the day before. So it was right up until the end is where we actually notified our staff.
Okay. And did you give them a letter dismissing them and then the buyer hiring them?
Yeah. So we our employees, we actually worked through a staffing company. So the staffing company was the employer of record, although we have the responsibility of hiring and terminating and all of that. But we actually went through the process of terminating all employees through my corporation, and then the new owner sent out a letter basically stating that he would pick up their employment under the new ownership.
Great, and that worked well.
It did work well, yeah.
Good. Robin, I know you had some long-term people. Did you do it a little differently?
A little bit. We went through the due diligence. I was very careful about making sure we got through the complete process of due diligence before notifying my 2 key employees. So it's pretty much right at the end.
Okay.
We had set aside a bonus for each of those 2 people, which they will earn after, one was 3 months and the other is 9 months to earn their full bonus, which is money that I set aside for the employees. And then, excuse me?
No, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, so The two key employees basically sat down with them, notified them. The next day we notified the entire staff. And I believe it was 2 days later that the transition was made where I released all the employees and then they were rehired. And part of the answer to the earlier question about was I happy with the sale of my business, that was another aspect of it, is they did rehire the entire staff, and the entire staff is still working, and everything's going really well. Yep.
Good. Was that bonus greatly appreciated? Do you recommend that to sellers for key employees?
I don't know that it was important to me because those two employees have just been very dedicated, and I felt deserved it regardless of
how they felt.
On or not. Right.
Yeah.
So, I don't know that I would recommend it or not recommend it. It depends on the situation.
Yeah. Oftentimes, if there's a, let's say in manufacturing, if there's a general manager that's really been running everything, the buyer is very nervous about losing that person, and that can help ensure them staying on, especially if you pay it a year later. So at least you've got them for a year. Let's see. Is there anything you might have done differently? Gary?
Probably the only thing I'd have done differently is doubled my sales and my income so I could have got a bigger price. Other than that, everything went so smooth. I mean, I often talk to people about that, but I sold the business from start to finish in 3 months. I don't think it goes any smoother than that.
Well, don't anybody else listening, that's not the norm, so don't expect that. How about you, Robert? Anything you would have done differently?
I am.
I'm so sorry. Not sure what we pushed. So you were saying you'd been in business over 40 years, and that's where it stopped.
Well, I think one thing about being in a small business is you're always learning new things, and I certainly learned a lot from this experience of selling my business. So I don't know that I would have done anything different, but I certainly learned a lot that I would probably do it a little different next time, just because I learned so much.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I know that your due diligence was pretty hefty. So I always say it's not for the faint of heart, because it's some buyers just want to see everything you've ever done, and you have to be ready, and you were. So that's good. Let's see. Robert, are you there?
He's going to be muted.
Okay. So, Gary, what are the key things to have ready for due diligence that you found that somebody needed?
So for me, the key things that I'd already kind of put in place, and I think makes it really simple, is I ran my business off of QuickBooks for the past 5 or 6 years at least before the sale. And my payroll was done through ADP, which was very clean. So the financials are what most buyers want to make sure that what they've been shown is realistic, and that made due diligence pretty simple, because they could click on any invoice or any deposit, and they could tie right back to stuff in the file cabinet, and it was really simple because I had those kind of records. Probably another one is just to make sure all your equipment's working properly, and you don't suddenly end up with, well, this needs to work, so you don't want to have any add backs, I guess you could say. You don't want them to ding you. So make sure all your equipment that's used in the business is working properly, and you got clean books that they can look at, and I think that's probably about it.
That's a good point. A lot of us in our business, will run personal things through it, which is very normal. But I would say if you're not, that's going to make it much easier for SBA to fund you for the amount that they normally do. If we're selling one now that the seller just had, almost a third of his bottom line through add backs, and it's going to be tougher for SBA to fund it. He's going to definitely sell it, but it's going to be more difficult. Let's see. I just got a question from someone that says, where are the buyers typically found? Well, I know with Sunbelt, we advertise on 21 web pages, and I'm trying to think of the three, Gary, Robert, and Robin. That's where, well, I don't know. I think just Gary and Robert, your buyer, came from those websites. Robin's came from indirectly from somebody that had seen the business that ended up not buying it, but referred it to a friend of his. So that was interesting. So that's one way. We also often do a target list of companies that might want to acquire the business, and that can be a very good way to find buyers. And then, of course, we have a huge database of buyers, so many different ways. And then we do webinars. People, potential buyers hear that, want to work with us. So that's how it's done. Robert, are you back on?
I am back with you.
Good. Sorry about that. Is there anything that you recommend to the audience, key things to have ready for due diligence that helped you?
You know,
Robert,
yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Joe.
I was just going to say that you were a franchisee, so you really have to keep really good records for the franchisor because you pay royalty.
That's right. Yeah, and I would say, you know, that helped us out a lot. Again, just being very meticulous about your books, I think really helped us in sort of anticipating, you know, what the buyer might ask for. I mean, in our case, it was a residential cleaning service, so we wanted to make ready all the financials as well as the repair records of the vehicles that we use, and you know, some staffing type things as well. You know, the buyer wanted to know about the staff and how long they were with us and who our key employees were. So just those little details and just sort of anticipating what the buyer is going to ask for.
Good. Did any of the three of you panelists have any issues with I-9s? Did the buyers want to see I-9s for your employees? Gary?
Yeah, and
Go ahead, Robert. You've got the floor.
that was true for us. Most of our employees were required to fill out I-9s, and the buyer did inquire about that, and of course we kept pretty good records there in the office. So anything that he needed to see was available there for him to review.
Okay, good. How about you, Robin? Anything with I-9s? Any issues?
No, we did not have any issues, and I think it's really important to have good payroll records, to have packets on each employee that has all of the paperwork that's required. We are a nursery, and we do use a lot of Hispanic labor, and so all of our records are pretty detailed in terms of what's required, and that was looked at pretty carefully by the buyer. I think having I have an accountant who does my quarterly reports, and they have for many years, so there's a lot of good financials available. And then we have a payroll service also, which makes the payroll very clean.
Yeah, what that does, just wanted to share it with the audience, is that if when they ask for things, the more quickly you can deliver those, the more confidence they have in the business. And you don't have to say, oh, well, maybe I can get that for you in a few weeks or a month. It just really builds confidence in the buyer. And what I've found is if a buyer is comfortable and trusts you, it'll probably move forward. But if they start, seeing sloppy records, it might not happen. Gary, did you have anything with I-9s?
Mine was 9 years ago, so I can't say in particular, except that I used ADP to do my payroll. So I don't know if that's something they would have handled, but
you didn't have.
I don't think I only had 4 or 5 employees, so
Yeah.
I just don't recall that being an issue, though.
Okay. any surprises that you found? And I know, Robin, you might want to address that. At closing, I know you had a surprise.
Yeah, well,
Do you know what I'm referring to?
Yes, I had an attorney's fees that were higher than I had anticipated. I think it came to almost $12,000, and I was thinking more in the 5 to 8 range. But the attorney did his job, and it wasn't a question of whether or not he earned what he was paid. It was more, I just hadn't set my head on that number.
Yeah. And I think just for the audience, we always recommend that you get an attorney, and some people do, some people don't. If it's a simple business and a clean contract that's easy to decipher yourself, but Robin's was a whole nother story. He had, I don't know how many pages, 35 pages of an asset purchase agreement that the buyers were attorneys that they put together, and there was a lot of language in there that we're not attorneys, so we're not able to do. So it wasn't an expense, but in all my experience in reading about larger deals, it's typically anywhere from $5,000 to $20,000, and that's for businesses that sell under $15 million. And and then there was another surprise with the Board of Equalization audit.
Yeah, so selling my business or the assets of my business triggered a State Board of Equalization audit, and I guess they typically will hold all of the money being paid until they do the audit. In my case, they held $250,000, and I believe they're meeting with my accountant Thanksgiving week.
Okay.
So the auditor for the state board will go in, and basically I am both wholesale and retail, so they want to look at who wasn't paying sales tax and whether or not all the documents support that they didn't pay sales tax.
Okay.
And that they're reselling the product. And so we're just waiting on that audit to free up that $250,000 of money.
And I know they're done randomly, but in my 18 years doing this, that was the first one I had seen. So
yeah, and it's the first time I have ever been audited, knock on wood.
Oh my God.
So yeah, it was a bit of a surprise, and
yeah, it was, but it'll be cleared up, and you'll get paid. So I think, Robert, was there any surprise for you?
No, I'm happy to say that it was really just a really smooth process for me. We had a motivated buyer, and we prepared books in advance. So yeah, no real surprises to speak of.
And Gary?
Probably my only surprise was how quickly I was replaced.
How quickly he was replaced. Okay, I'm going to unmute it, and if anybody has a question,
the conference has been unmuted.
We can take those now. Does anybody have a question of any of the three panelists? You all did a good job. No questions. Going once. Twice. Okay. Thank you guys very much for joining us today. And I hope it was helpful to the audience. I know I've already gotten some comments that it was from a few of them. So thank you so much, Gary, Robert, and Robin. And I wish you all the best in your retirement.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joan.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.